Or do I just write my name?
Okay, so I hope this is working. Dr. Cavalli said that he's going to be watching online, so wave to the camera. Hopefully he can see us. Here, I'll pan it. We have a little bit of a crowd going on today. I'm excited. I don't know about you guys, but none of my professors are in town, so this was the only reason why I even came to campus today. So I'm glad that you guys actually showed up. I didn't want to be the only one. Thank you for coming to another Political Science Student Association meeting. For those of you that are new, but we do have a lot of familiar faces, I'm Dominic, the president of the Political Science Student Association. This is Anita, our vice president. Today we're going to be talking about the results of last night's, not just presidential elections, but there were a few House races, and there was a senatorial race as well in both Virginia and Ohio, I believe. I don't know, we can Google it, I guess, but yeah, right now we're going to start by passing around this attendance sheet. Please just write your name and your faculty advisor. We can't guarantee that you'll get extra credit, but Dr. Cavalli does actually email all of your professors asking them to provide you with extra credit for attending these meetings. Like I said, we can't guarantee you'll get it, but I know that if you have him as a professor, you get it, so that's pretty cool. We can get started. Today we don't have a faculty advisor, and I know that Dr. Cavalli is usually our bouncing point whenever things get awkward or we don't know where to start. I want to hear just like briefly what you guys noticed this morning after the election, because today is about the election results, and then maybe we can get more into like how last night played out and what you guys were doing as the votes turned in.
I didn't really watch it. I don't really watch the news unless my parents are playing it at their house, so I don't really know. But I did get this message, like, it was like Trump won votes in like South Carolina, I think. Was that?
I think North Carolina was one of the first states that was.
Yeah, I did get like a notification on that.
Where'd you get the notification
It was
from?
like,
Apple News?
yeah, like Apple News probably.
Oh wow, that's crazy.
I was getting those too.
All right.
I can go.
You can go ahead.
I guess afterwards, what I've noticed so far, and I kind of noticed the same thing back when Trump won in 2016, but I feel like there is, for some reason, this initial reaction of like, oh God, we're all screwed. It's like fear mongering almost that I now see on social media, but back then I saw it like. I remember going into class in like 7th grade and my teacher just immediately started going in on Trump and how we're all like gonna die, and it was just very interesting to bring into the classroom in my opinion. But I am seeing that kind of now online this time around.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed, just solely based off of social media, seeing what my friends and family have said. I've seen like 3 different types of reactions, honestly. I've seen the pro-Trump, I guess, campaigners. They're all ecstatic about the results. Then I've seen actually a lot of people here in Dahlonega who are Democratic that I really do commend, especially in the Multicultural Student Association. I saw a video made by one student particularly reaching out to Latino voters, saying like, hey, we are the party of unity, and right now is not the time to belittle one another for having differing political views. That's actually a huge thing that I think that we can do on like a local level and an individual level, is to remind each other that at the end of the day, we do live next to each other, we go to school with one another, we work with one another, and we don't need to like cannibalize this into some sort of digital civil war. And then I've also seen people, mostly on the Democratic camp, being a little bit straightforward with it. I guess you can call it fear-mongering, but they genuinely like are concerned about the future of the country. And so just to like call it fear-mongering is kind of unfair, because they genuinely do believe a lot of these policies and actions are going to be implemented. So they seem genuinely worried. But what I don't like to see, and I preface this by starting every meeting by, hey guys, let's be respectful, no name calling, no this or that. It's already started on social media, and I just hope that we don't see this trend happening again.
I hope we don't see it.
Yeah, I hope we don't see it happening again. Does anybody? Yeah.
Usually I try not to get too political and stuff.
Yeah.
I actually didn't vote year's election.
Yeah, neither did I.
I registered, I think last year, and I voted for Georgia governor and my town mayor, I believe. But this time I didn't vote. If I would have voted, I would have probably been an independent voter for Robert F. Kennedy. He seemed like a very personable guy, a very I'm not on either side, and I want to bring these two sides that are warring at each other, and like we're saying here, like fear mongering, because both sides of the spectrum are fear mongering each other. Even before the election and even after the election, you see Republicans are like, well, if Kamala wins, the economy will be dead and everybody's jobs will be screwed and immigration is like, that's their side of the view. And then our side is like, well, if Trump wins, Project 2025, blah, blah. Like, there's these two sides that are like just warring, and there's not really any conversation about like policies and what will be done and actually how we will fix things in this, in the economy, or fix the immigration issues, or fix any of these problems. A lot of the talk on, the news, and of course, it's the media, so they want to overplay it and kind of be like, well, this is the exciting stuff going on, but he was talking about, well, I want to unify, I want to bring together, and I want the separation of these two parties to stop. And that's why I was kind of rooting for him, but then he kind of joined Trump's team, and I was like, well, you just went against what you were saying since the beginning. You were saying you're not on either side, but then you joined one of the sides. Come on.
To be fair, I think Robert F. Kennedy did make a public statement saying that he reached out to the Democratic campaign strategists trying to figure out if he could work with them. His family's historically been Democratic and he wanted to work with them, but he just had some views that they couldn't ride behind, they couldn't, justify, and so he felt a little alienated. I think that's why he went independent in the first place, but recognizing that he wasn't going to pull the way that he wanted to. I don't think his strategy necessarily, obviously he wants to win the presidency, I don't think his strategy necessarily was to win the presidency. I think he was just reaching for that 5% vote so that he could get federal funds, and potentially 4 years from now we could see an independent party that's a lot stronger than the one we see today that does have a viable chance for the presidency. But what I see from the Republican campaign in bringing him into their entire, strategy was that right now they're trying to build a certified, not a certified, but a strong conservative front, similar to how Reagan tried doing in the 80s. This is one thing that I wasn't really expecting though, because my bet was that the House was going to flip blue and that the Senate was going to be maintained blue. I just feel like Congress has been, their approval ratings have dropped severely. I think there's less trust in Congress's ability to govern right now than there is in the mainstream media, which is a concerning statistic. So I was worried that what was going to end up happening, or not necessarily worried, but what I assumed what was going to end up happening was that the House and the Senate, so Congress in general, would stay blue. And then like the news and every other polling industry has been saying, Kamala was probably going to win the popular vote, and the electoral college was just going to be a toss-up between a few 7 states. But right now, when I'm looking at the election results, the Senate is returned to the Republican Party, and the House is leading right now in a few of their elections. So it looks like there's going to be a triumvirate going in. This election is actually pretty historical. I'm a young guy, so everything's historical for me because I'm only experiencing it for the first time ever. But I believe that since Grover Cleveland, Donald Trump is the first president to have lost an election and then run for re-election and then win. So to see him win in that manner and to see him maintain a triumvirate, it's kind of encouraging to me, because if Congress is lacking, if Congress is inefficient, this may be a path to seeing a little bit more trust in our government and seeing them to actually be able to pass legislation. Now they are going to have to reach bipartisan consent, and they're going to have to make sure that these policies are generalizable to the entire nation and not just their own party. You can go ahead and get your hand up.
Yeah. Looking at this from the polls perspective, this was a very tight race. Well, sadly still going on because Nevada and is still counting their votes, though it is leaning towards Trump. One of the biggest takeaways from this election, in the polls at least, is what went wrong, I guess, with the Democratic Party with their candidate. And one of the biggest issues that Kamala faced was her I guess her connection to Joe Biden. The biggest issue with undecideds about this election was the economy. They say, I don't like how Joe Biden is running the economy, or that's how they feel, and that they believe that they were nostalgic for Trump's sort of 3 years of sort of good economy. So that's where a lot of this that's the reason why he won, was because the economy was the biggest issue on voters on independents or undecided voters' minds. So it's not really shocking. I say that this election isn't really shocking in terms of its turnout. It was a coin flip. What did shock me was the fact that the House might still be red. The Cavalli has talked about the Senate going red for a while now, so that wasn't really a shock to me. But the House may still be in Republican control, and that gives Trump a trifecta of power. So yeah, looking at it from the polls perspective, it's not shocking, but it also is an interesting, I guess, sort of scenario. So yeah.
Do you want to say something, and then we'll turn it into
Yeah, I do agree with what he said earlier. Like, it's when I say that one party's doing something right now, I mostly mean it because that party just lost the election. Of course, it's going to be talked about, but I try to say it every time, but both parties have some real serious problems, especially in the media. It's just insane that I can flip the channel by one button and it's going to be an entirely different storyline depending on the channel. And with Kennedy, it is unfortunate. He was my first choice, I'd say, back when he was in the running. But when we have a two-party system like that, and I believe that Kennedy really is just trying to get in office some way, somehow, to make a difference and, quote, make America healthy again. So I can understand why he had to take that route. And I hope that even if Trump wasn't your preferred candidate, Kennedy being in office is some sort of it's better than him maybe not having any part of it. And for Kamala separating herself from Biden, or at least trying to, even though she had a short amount of time to campaign compared to Trump and the odds were kind of stacked against her with Biden dropping out, I just feel like she really could have done a better job separating herself from Biden. She was asked directly what she would do differently, and she said not a thing comes to mind. I know we've talked about it before, but I truly think that that should have been a main strategy of her campaign if we're going into her running, beginning her whole campaign, knowing that the people are not happy with the state of the economy under Biden. I think she tried to do somewhat of a 180, but it just wasn't enough. She at least didn't prove it enough.
I was going to say to add on to that you're right, economics got a lot more to play with it than anything else, because while I keep up a lot of economic sort of news, the thing is, people were always berating the whole, but your individual story of not making as much is less important than the statistics saying that the median or the average has gone up. The problem is in those is that they take a one-dimensional view of that statistic and don't look at the fact that even if you put that on a even distribution bell curve, you're still showing that then half of them are making less than that. That then pointing out and trying to invalidate people's fight by saying, but statistically you should be doing better, is not going to invalidate the individual's experience. And that while they say they got inflation back under control, the issue is that it's still ahead of where many people are earning. And that even with policies in place to try to lower prices, it's still not catching up. Wages are always a lagging economic indicator when it comes to inflation or any other sort of issue. And people have felt that, and they didn't like being talked down to that their issues weren't real
I think that you guys are all bringing up unique and great points. And I like hearing talking points that aren't being repeated and repeated over and over again on the media. But one thing that I noticed, if any of you attended the presidential election forum that was hosted here in UNG Dahlonega, one of the major talking points was actually about the polling industry. And I don't know how many of you read the UNG Vanguard, but we have a newspaper here on campus. And both Dr. Cavalli and I were both reached out to weigh in on the historicity of this year's election. One trend that I see is glaring right now, and you guys can correct me if you believe I'm wrong, but I really truly believe that the polling industry in the United States is dying. It's not as strong as it once was. I get the notion of this being a tight-knit race, but even looking at the popular votes right now, they're still being counted in. Trump is leading by about 3 million or so votes. Like, I don't think anybody was expecting him, especially by looking at the polls, to win the popular vote in the first place. Another thing is I was telling people yesterday before polls even opened that this entire election result is going to hinge on the fact of either Republicans underestimated how important an issue abortion is to women in the United States, or Democrats are going to underestimate how strong the support is for the Trump campaign and how much support there is for Donald Trump and his policies. I can 100% agree that Kamala Harris had a difficult time distancing herself from Joe Biden while also having to remind the American people that, yeah, I was in office the last 4 years. And the main reason why I see that being an issue is because how does she balance being in office and also not looking disloyal to her president and to her own party? I think this was also a huge talking point when we look at Biden dropping out of the race in the first place. Inherently, she was like the clear choice to be the vice presidential candidate or the presidential candidate, being on his ticket in 2020, in the position that she was in as vice president, she would be the clear choice for this. But a huge talking point that I heard amongst people that are not necessarily even involved in politics is, hey, in 2020 she did try to run for president and she didn't really win many primary votes. We look now at the election and she hasn't overcome Biden in any of the 50 states by a 3% margin. And I think that's because her campaign strategy was to make abortion the issue on this year's election. However, exit polls are showing now that the main issue, while economy is at number 2, was actually democracy. And so I think it's kind of, it's ironic, and I don't know if it's for better or for worse. It's ironic that democracy seems to be the number 1 issue that people are worried about when leaving the polls, when Kamala was campaigning on the fact that their party was the one that was going to protect democracy. So it seems to be that the American electorate really believes that Donald Trump is the best option for either promoting democracy or enhancing it, which I don't really know how that's going to play out in the future. I'm not a mind reader. I'm not a fortune teller. But I think that there's a lot of irony in that fact in and of itself. Yeah.
So that poll is really interesting because I think it comes down to what's your definition of democracy, right? Mm-hmm. And it might be that, I wouldn't be surprised if there's these different views about what democracy is and how it should run. So, and also, exit polls are exit polls. Yeah. And you mentioned, I think polling is, I'm not a math person, but polling is pretty good. The problem is the audience. It's tapping into people who don't have a landline phone.
Yeah, 100%.
Those kinds of things. So just think.
Yeah, I've done, this is so difficult. How does Cavalli do this? I've done door canvassing and polling before. The most difficult part, yes, is reaching out to those low propensity voters, but it's also just getting somebody to respond to the poll in the first place. After the 2016 election, a lot of the major polling companies actually halted their operations. And so we see, at least in this election, that there was a lot of partisan pollsters, particularly for the Republican Party in the first place. So with combining the fact that it's difficult to get people to respond to polls, many of these pollsters are now partisan, and the fact that it's really costly So if we extrapolate this, about 100,000 citizens are going to need to be reached out to in order to get a sample size that's reflective enough of the entire U.S. population. And there are certain demographics that are more likely to answer and respond to these polls in the first place, that typically being young, white, educated college women and men, but typically women are more likely to respond to these polls in the first place. So this is difficult to actually generalize to the entire population because we aren't sure if these particular voters that are more likely to respond in the first place are going to be reflective of the ideology of the entire nation as a whole. You can go ahead, and then he had his hand up.
Sorry, real quick. The election was in the margin of error.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. It could swing either way. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I just want to bring up. I heard something, an interview on NPR, National Public Radio, for those who don't know what that is. About 3 weeks ago, they were canvassing Michigan, and there was a Muslim event in Detroit, and they were talking to people who you're going to vote for. And they had different populations saying you're going to vote for Harris, not voting. And then there was a group that said they were going to vote for Trump. They're not Republicans, they are Democrats, but they're going to vote for Trump because of Biden's response to the Gaza crisis. And here was their calculus, and I never thought of this, and I thought it was really interesting. They said, if he gets elected, they don't feel he'll be able to do much in 4 years, or nothing really will change, I think was the phrase they used. 2028 is what they're thinking about. So their goal was to make an impact in this election. So in 2028, if you want Michigan, you're going to have to talk to that population. And I find that incredible, and it really got me excited in a couple other ways, which is here's a population that just 22 years ago was demonized. We were jailing Muslims. We were denying them entry into the country. We were exercising them out. And in a 22-year period of time, they might become a swing vote population. I think that's a really cool thing about democracy.
You had something to add?
Yeah, it was, when it came to your part about democracy and it being a primary issue, regardless of party line, you must admit that the executive chief and leader of a nation handpicking their successor and not allowing the primary to function does give off the whole anti-democratic feeling, especially when added into the whole especially comment of they weren't that popular in the previous primary which they attended. It can add to the feeling of why what made that successful in that area. And to talk into the polling, you're completely right. When it comes to sampling, voluntary response is one of the hardest and also one of the most unreliable methods of sampling due to the fact that you're always going to either get besides demographics, you also have to admit that you will only get extreme responses. People who have neutral or lukewarm leanings are not going to often respond in polling or any sort of voluntary sample. It's just part of the nature because they're not going to actually given a binary choice. On top of that, let's say you're talking about Arabs or Muslims.
Muslim population.
Yes, I
Detroit.
was gonna say that's where foreign policy kind of played into I think this election where while maybe not as important issue as like certain like echo chambers of online and in real space sort of want to show it as, it is a big part of demographic voting measures. And the fact that both candidates have the identical stance on it and demonize the exact same population can be shown in, and so have we still gotten any of the data on demographic voting yet?
That would be interesting to find out
Yes.
what Michigan went, like how Michigan went in that way.
Because I wouldn't be surprised if it was just a straight drop across the board because there was no candidate that would even support them because both were both were for their alienation.
So, one interesting thing about this, Michigan was such an outlier for me. I was not expecting it to lean red. I think that you actually are onto a good point. I think that the huge part of the, at least a significant part of the Muslim population may have just not voted at all, or maybe they went independent, and so that cannibalized the Democratic vote. But I will argue that both candidates had the same stance on at least the Israel-Gaza conflict. there was a news article that I'd seen recently on, I believe it was, I can't remember if it was AP News, but it was showing a campaign ad by the Harris campaign that was being shown in Wisconsin and in Michigan. And they were both from the same rally. It's just in the Michigan ad, they had cut out the part of her speaking about doubling down on like Israel's right to defend itself. But in the Wisconsin ad, doubling down, or it was Pennsylvania because that's where a large Jewish population and Catholic population is, doubling down on Israel's right to defend itself. But in Michigan, the same ad was changed to focus highly on Gaza's conflict and Gaza's ability to have sovereignty and autonomy in their decision-making processes. So I think that the Harris campaign, when we talk about like, I don't think anybody's focusing right now majorly on how Donald Trump won. I think like the main focus right now is how Democrats lost. And I think it's because she was trying to cater to too broad of an audience while also alienating like the working class traditional like conservative man. And the main reason why I say that is because I was watching her ads on the living room candidate, and I didn't necessarily see any advertisements from her that really spoke to that specific demographic. If anything, I saw one ad where it said it was countering traditional views of masculinity and saying like this is what it really means to be a man. What it really means to be a man is to support a woman. And I don't necessarily think that was going to win over a huge share of the vote, mainly because nobody that I know that's traditionally conservative really has a problem with a woman being in office. They just wanted to hear what Kamala had to say about what she would do when she was in office. And I think she played a little bit too much into the identity politics of her being a woman and thinking that that would carry her to the White House, because I don't think that's what most people were concerned about. As you've mentioned, the economy was a big issue, democracy, immigration's another issue, and abortion was a huge issue. And so she tried to just bring that up to the forefront, which in her favor, that was really smart strategy because young women are typically more likely to go out to vote in the first place. So if you can mobilize an entire population to all agree with what you're saying, then you have a higher likelihood of being elected into office. But I think it kind of bit them in the butt, honestly.
Yeah, on that note, with sort of Kamala's performance during this election, is that you are right, she did try to appeal to everyone in a sense. One of the biggest issues, I think in this recent election, it might be the most divided among the genders. I think we see a lot more men vote Republican and women vote Democrat than we've seen in a long time. I could be mistaken, but I think that's definitely a real notable sort of poll is the gender divide with these issues. And a big sort of, speaking about sort of Kamala's tactics, she was, with her short campaign period and also the fact that immigration and economy were Trump's biggest sort of benefits, wins with people, it was just, she had to focus on abortion and more social issues because that's where she did the best in, with abortion and with healthcare and other issues. So yeah, it's definitely, I think there's a lot of, it's pretty easy to kind of know where she kind of struggled with her campaign. With the big thing with Michigan was the Gaza conflict, and that one is where she lost a lot of support with Muslim Americans or immigrants.
Unions.
And unions also, yeah. If I remember correctly, there was a poll recently that showed that I think unions favored Trump a bit more. But yeah, just polling all around, she just struggled.
I mean, to a fair point, it was within the margin of error, so it's not like the polls were entirely inaccurate. They just couldn't pinpoint exactly how it was going to play out. Yeah, you can go ahead.
I was going to say, when it came to ads, I don't know if it's ever. And I get as a battleground state, we're gonna get very like flavored ads, but it kind of gave me the idea that they just kind of abandoned the lower class, which ironically might be one of the best kind of things you'd be trying to go, especially if you're trying to appeal to everyone, because traditionally a lot of working class, lower class, or people try to usually vote to the right Republican sort of leanings. And so, and the fact that everything was focused on the middle class ads, explicitly stating that, kind of felt like it was specifically just excluding a big part of the population, because I live in a county that's honestly very poor. So for me, it felt like kind of an odd move to focus on our politics. And on the policy notes, I actually read through some of our policies, like the housing one, where it still wasn't protected from private equity, still wasn't protected from private investments, competing on some of those homes that promised to get built. And ironically, I found a more progressive stance in my local ballot with capping the valuation of property at 3% than I did in her entire policy. So I'm not really sure how to take that.
The housing policies that Kamala had, I also think were kind of contradictory to tax. Like, I think she had a policy on taxing net gain. So, I mean, if you own a property and that property increases in value, then that value is going to be taxed even more. So if you are a middle class person who even struggled to get a down payment on that house in the first place, and you're struggling month to month to pay your mortgage, now as that property increases in value, you're going to have to pay more and more. This is going to happen anyway, but I can't remember exactly how she phrased it. But another thing about, we keep bringing up low class, middle class, and that's why I think that Donald Trump kind of took the advantage in this election, was that he's sort of built a conservative front right now amongst the working class that's multiracial. He focused on reaching to the demographics that he needed to reach to in order to win this election. So, for example, Kamala needed the female vote. I think that if females would have came out in droves, that she would have probably taken this by a landslide. Donald Trump needed the minority vote, and so what he did was he tried to appeal, regardless of his immigration stance, he tried to appeal to Black and Latino men. We see that 54% of Latino men in this election voted for Donald Trump. Historically, I think that in 2020, he only got about 32% of all Latino votes. Then in 2016, he got 32%. In 2020, he got about 45%. And this year, he's about 51%. So he's only steadily increasing this minority share. And typically, you would think of the Democratic Party as the party of the minority or the party of the working man. And he's trying to capitalize on that and show that, no, this is a new realignment. And I wonder if I actually want to ask the political science professor if, you're not history? Okay, so this actually relates perfectly to that discipline. Do you think that we're entering a sixth political party system here in the United States? I know we've had 5 historically. Do you think we're seeing a realignment right now?
So what would that sixth be? 3 parties? Or like how do you defining the sixth system?
Okay, so when I think of the first system, I think of the Whigs or the anti-federalists,
Or
federalists.
for the last one, that's different now from the last, or the one we are in, or to what we're coming to. How would you define what it is, and then we'll talk about what it might be becoming.
Okay, so when I think of the 5th political party system, I think it starts with Reagan creating a conservative coalition amongst Republicans, and then it also has Bill Clinton involved in there by catering to more fiscally conservative policies.
So
Well,
Democrats,
yes.
the right, the Republicans.
And so you have more of a centrist Democrat, which carried on to the Obama campaign until we have Obama's second campaign, where identity politics starts to play a larger role, and they're focused more on being the party of the minority than they are being the party of the working class. And this inherently was a pivot point for Republicans to bring these people into their coalition.
Yeah. I'm going to say that I think that the Republicans are grabbing that working class thing back in, with Reagan, under Reagan. It was the first to ask, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And then that was a direct question, or the rhetoric was directly aimed at sort of this middle class, blue class worker. We're just coming out of, a recession. So I don't know where we are now. I would have been more, I'm thinking about Ross Perot, you know, and he grabbed like 20%. 20% of the vote he grabbed. No third party candidate had ever come close. I thought something real was going to happen then, and then it fizzled out. So I would, maybe something's happening now, but I can't really say. Right?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to say
Yeah.
anything when you're living in it.
Yeah.
I have three things. My first thing is a question. Do we think that Trumpism and Trump has changed like how Republicans and how that party thinks, how they vote? What type of people are now voting specifically not only just for Republican, but also for the ideologies of like Trumpism and like how Trump has kind of become a symbol almost of the Republican Party?
So your question is, do I think Trumpism has changed the Republican Party and their voting bloc?
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think that Trumpism in itself is something that can even really be defined, because as a candidate, he's changed a lot since 2016. While his rhetoric may be the same, he's always been a political outsider, and that's what inherently we talk about when we say that politics and the establishment is not the same as it used to be. But this door was open not just for the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party. We have champions of liberal ideology like Alexandra Cortez, who, like, on a similar notion, uses the media to her advantage, to be able to use the media as a platform. And this goes back into the idea of Congress being inefficient, because right now they're playing a game of who can take responsibility for what and who can pass the most legislation. But with both chambers in Congress being with different parties, it's just gridlock and clash. I think what Trumpism is doing, at least now in 2024, is that it's making a lot more people, it's allowing a lot more traditionally conservative people to be more confident in themselves. When we think of the culture war, which is like typically how it's described in sociology, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Democrats won the cultural war. I mean, the civil rights movement was tremendous for like establishing equal rights, so not just the grounds of race, but also sex in Title IX. So we see like a huge push for a more secular society, and so I don't typically like the rhetoric of being a conservative nowadays on a college campus is like being a hippie back in like the counterculture movement. But I do see some parallels in the fact that it's a lot, at least at one point, probably about a year ago, if you were to be a traditional conservative, you would get a lot more ostracized by the left than in particular. And so I think that what Trump is trying to do, because he can't run for re-election again, he's got his second term, and I really don't think that he's going to do anything to try to remain in office for any longer than he needs to be. I think what he's trying to do right now is build a legacy, and the Trump that we're seeing now is not the same Trump that we saw in 2016, that we saw in 2020. He's starting to recognize that he needs to cater to a broader audience and that he can't be so standoffish, and so he's trying to use that to his advantage. Man almost got shot in the head, so he's probably had a little bit of an awakening and realized, like, hey, we have to turn this country into a new direction, and what that direction is, like I said, we're living in it, so we'll see what it looks like in the future.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Respectfully, everything he has been saying runs counter to that. He's talked about sending district attorneys after his sentence. He's talked about prosecuting members of the press. Of course, sending the army to deport people door to door. I mean, his euphoria or his conciliation after the assassination lasted like I think 3 days. So I think his rhetoric is 10 times worse or more vitriolic than the things he was saying in the first run. It's pretty, I mean, if we believe him, and I'm going to trust him at his word at this point, because the things he's done have been worse than what he said so far, right? So I got to say, man, he's not saying let's turn a new leaf.
No, I can't argue. I can't disagree entirely, but we've said it in one of these meetings before, is that with J.D. Vance, the role that he's playing is trying to be the Trump mouthpiece. I don't know if you've ever seen like the Obama interpreter on Key and Peele, but that's exactly the opposite vibe that I see with Trump and J.D. Vance, is that Trump can get away with saying these pretty extreme claims, and and JD Vance can come in as damage control and try to.
Okay, that's all rhetoric, though. That doesn't change policy.
Yeah, and that doesn't change policy, but with like, for example, political prosecution, back in 2016, everybody was worried that Trump was going to prosecute Hillary Clinton after the October surprise, and he would have been able to once he got into office, yet he didn't. And so I think that's just like a clear example of sometimes Trump says things to rile up the voters.
Well, if I could just jump in, there were people who mattered and cared about governance, and they, by the last year, they were all gone. And he had more of his people. And I think the clumsiness and the seriousness of the people he had in the last administration balanced things out. We still had January 6th, right? We still had January 6th. And now those people, he doesn't have career-minded individuals. He have his people running when he prefers or perhaps gives them room to do. So
Yeah, that's a great point. I'll turn it over real quick.
Alan's alone.
No, you're fine. Just one other thing on that is that when Trump went into office in 2016, he was a newbie, and so he didn't necessarily know who was putting into office. I don't really think that plays a factor into why he made the decision to relieve a lot of them of their duties when they were just trying to do their job in the first place. But I think what he's doing right now, especially on the campaign trail and all these announcements with RFK and Elon Musk, is he is trying to build his own coalition of like-minded individuals in order to see a little bit more efficiency within the executive branch. I don't know how that's going to play out, though.
I did see something else that I was pretty interested by, and this has to do with the House and the Senate and the other votes that were going on last night. I saw that a couple of the representatives and the Senate peoples were actually voted in as, or were in as independent, which I found pretty interesting because I didn't think that any independent candidate whatsoever would have been introduced into this election whatsoever. I didn't know that I didn't know that the party was strong enough that they could get into the Senate or the House or any of that. I didn't realize that was a thing that could happen.
That's a fair assessment. Right now, I think that about 67% of Americans don't align with either of the parties. That's one statistic in and of itself. And also on a local level, independents have a much higher chance of getting elected because there's going to be a lower voter turnout in the first place. So if you can campaign through a grassroots organization and get more people that agree with your policies out to vote in the first place, you just have a higher chance of winning in such a polarized environment.
Yeah, on the topic of Trumpism and let's just say his plans or his concept of plans. I will admit, for me at least, it's concerning. His policies have appeared to be extremely partisan, extremely unwilling to work with the other side. At least with Kamala, she's worked with Republicans, or at least tried to. She worked with Dick Cheney and previous Trump staffers during his presidency. To regard him as a threat, I mean, you have to think how much is hyperbole when Trump's own cabinet of this previous administration are calling him fascists, like Mark Kelly and the other general. Like these aren't just people who are Democrats or centrists or types. These are people who work with them personally. And this and seeing RFK, I'm sorry, but RFK is an anti-vaxxer. He believes that vaccines cause autism. I don't think I'd want him being a part of the Department of Health. So, like, the people who he is surrounding him, is cause for concern. Again, these aren't like the career politicians who can sort of wrangle Trump away from certain extreme ideals. So yeah, I mean, Trump is different from 2016 because he is more, I was going to say, he is more of a risk compared to 2016. There are more people, there are less safeguards around him, and with his ideas around the other side, it's cause for concern. So yeah.
And I think we have to start wrapping up soon. If anybody wants closing comments, just raise your hand and I'll turn the camera towards you.
I think looking at like what you were saying with the cabinet and a lot of his members turning against him or whatever the case might have been.
Even Mike Pence to win law enforcement.
Right. I understand that, but I think we can look just as easily at the now lifelong Democrats like Tulsi Gabbard, and I know you don't want to use Kennedy as an example
Bless you.
because you find him to be an extremist, and I respect that. I understand where you're coming from, but a lot of people do find him to be a good independent option. I mean, if you look at some of the polls, he's getting like, I think I saw 2% in some of the states of the vote for Kennedy, even though he's telling people, please do not put me down, please put Trump down on the ballot, don't put me down. So clearly there's enough of an audience that finds him to be independent enough. So if we're looking at sort of independents or Democrats that Trump, I do believe he is trying to include some of that in his cabinet, but I understand how with your party affiliation, seeing the Senate, the House, and maybe some of the other people that he's bringing into his cabinet, I can see where you think that maybe it could turn extremist, but agree to disagree, I guess.
Yeah, it's how you see it. It's whether he.
Right.
It's if you're on the idea that Trump will not do much in this 4 years, he might go on. It's where you see it. Because it can go either way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do nothing or do a lot.
That being said, though, the agree and disagree is a great thing that we're able to do here, and to be able to communicate our values here in a reasonable way. And we want to thank y'all for coming here today. We're about to wrap up, but
Yeah.
presidential election isn't the only important thing. There's also local elections, and just keep that in mind. We'll be back here next week, Wednesday. And do we have a topic for next Wednesday?
Next Wednesday, not sure what the topic's going to be, but next Thursday, I'm pretty sure that we're planning on hosting our capstone for our fundraiser that we were having for Hurricane Helene. If you guys weren't able to donate anything, we understand we're college students, but you can still check out our website, see our donor wall, and there's also an Amazon wish list where we have things as cheap as $1 to $2 that we're going to be shipping out to the area. So keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, we're taking a lot of different donations, so if you have like old clothes that you're not wearing anymore, canned goods, anything like that, great.
People were saying